This year, reunions, memorials, and monuments mark 50 years since the end of World War II, and Japan has asked for an apology for using the atomic bomb to end that war. This year, veterans of the war in the Pacific will relive the battles for those islands of volcanic sand where good men laid down their lives for flag and country. Graphic films and pictures of those battles will stir memories in the dim corners of the mind to recall the heat of battle and the fear of death. On the 22nd of May, a few good men will gather to recall their part in history. The survivors of the 4th Regiment of United States Marines will recall China Knights and their part in the defense of the Philippine Islands. It was there that poorly armed American troops bought time for America, time to gather strength for the battles to come. There are no films of their battles or of their suffering as prisoners of war. Only those who were there can relive the battles they fought and the horrors they suffered as prisoners of war. The winds of war swept across the China Seas long before the people of America were aware of the coming storm. In November of 1941, the 4th Marines were pulled out of Shanghai, China to the Philippines, where they were joined by other Marines stationed in the islands. The primary mission of the 4th Regiment was to defend the beaches of Corregidor. More than 50% of the regiment perished in combat or on Japanese held ships or from savage treatments as prisoners of war. Following the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese tidal wave of conquest rolled down the Pacific until it smashed against the defenses of Bataan and Corregidor, the Alamo of the Pacific. The defenders of Bataan and Corregidor were the first troops to meet the enemy in mortal combat. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but held their ground until late March of 1942, when the Japanese had massed 50,000 fresh troops along the battle line on Bataan. And across that battle line waited the battling bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, and nobody gave a damn. The battling bastards were 27,000 combat-weary troops, the remnants of the Army's 31st Infantry Division, Philippine Army units, Filipino scouts, Air Corps personnel without aircraft, sailors without ships, and select units of the 4th Marines. They had been on half rations since January, but they had already decimated one Japanese army, and Bataan fell on April the 9th of 1942. The survivors were brutalized, bayoneted, or shot as they were driven more than 90 miles in tropic heat on the infamous Bataan Death March. These were the men with obsolete weapons who held the Japanese at bay for 6 months during one of the greatest sieges in modern military history. They held out long enough for the Navy to recover from Pearl Harbor and win the Battle of the Coral Sea. They held out long enough to prevent the invasion of Australia. Their heroic stand gave America time to gather its forces and win every battle for those islands of volcanic sand in the Pacific. History shows that America suffered no military defeats in the Pacific following the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. The battling bastards of Bataan turned the tide of war and changed the course of history. The survivors suffered nearly 4 years of hell at the hands of the Japanese. It is estimated that only 1 out of 10 Americans who stood in defense of the Philippines survived to return home 50 years ago. In the dark corners of the mind of those who did survive lurk the memories of starvation and physical atrocities committed by the Japanese. Only another prisoner of war can understand the magnitude of the barbaric and vicious conduct of their captors. The defenders of the Alamo of the Pacific may have been surrendered, but they were never defeated. They were fighting men without weapons who continued the battle through sabotage in the shipyards, the rail yards, and other slave labor camps. Peace is returned to Bataan and Corregidor, yet there are those who insist that on a quiet night, the moon is high, winds play strange tricks of acoustics. Like a seashell held to the ear, the sounds of pitched battle echo through the trees, caves, and tunnels, where brave men died in battle that ended on the 6th of May of 1942. And each year in May, the few good men who were the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor remember those who are gone but not forgotten, and each year that roster grows longer. For the generations of Americans who are too young to remember the Bataan Death March, it's difficult to comprehend the terrible suffering endured by American prisoners of war at the hands of the Japanese. Ignoring these atrocities, the Japanese have asked America to apologize. Those who survived that horror have suffered for 50 years without apology, without acknowledgement or compensation for the barbaric treatment they endured at the hands of the Japanese as prisoners of war. There's no national memorial or monument to the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor. The atrocities committed by the Japanese are swept aside in today's politically correct view that America was the villain in World War II, as was illustrated in the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian. Please, America, remember the Alamo of the Pacific, ignore the Japanese demand for apology, and honor the men who stood in defense of the Philippines. They put their life on their line for their country, and they gave so much more.